Thanks, Matt, and thanks all of you for coming. It's true that, at least in my lifetime, I not only have never seen such a question posed in a public setting, but I was absolutely sure I never would. The fact that it is says something about how the political culture has shifted in this country quite dramatically and in a very short period of time. So that being said, let me get to the point. The question is it time for the United States to embrace socialism? And any meaningful answer to that requires first a definition of what we mean by that so that we all know that we're on the same page. I will take socialism now to mean two things. A set of principles about what is good and bad, fair and unfair in the world, and then a set of institutions to further and then to embody and institutionalize those principles. I think for socialists, there are three main principles that most of them can agree upon. And I'm going to say these in a kind of minimal way. Minimally, all socialists agree, first of all, that the market should not be the arbiter of people's fate, their well-being, so it has to be constrained in some way. For some socialists, that means abolishing the market altogether. For other socialists like myself, it means simply reducing its scope. Secondly, economic decision makers, people who actually are holding investable funds, the wealth-creating funds of society, they have to be democratically accountable in some way so they don't have unilateral power over people's lives. And thirdly, that the inequalities in wealth and income should not be allowed to translate into inequalities in political power. That is, politics should, as much as possible, be a domain in which people participate with more or less equal resources and equal say, which massive inequalities in wealth tend to undermine. So those are the three principles that I think socialists agree upon. Now, what about the institutions that embody this? Well, again, there's a few here that I think all socialists can agree upon. First of all, a significant expansion of the welfare state so that at the very least, the basic needs of people are provided to them on a decommodified basis. What we mean by decommodified basis is your ability to acquire essential goods for your livelihood and for your well-being shouldn't depend on your performance in the labor market, whether or not you have a job, how good the job is, how much money you have, those sorts of things. Second, a massive increase in taxation on economic and wealth so that the material inequalities between people in society can be reduced. The justification for this tends to be of many kinds, but at the very least, what it means is it will reduce the extent of political inequalities, and it also increases the likelihood of some kind of social solidarity in society, a sense of community, which vast inequalities tend to rip apart. And that sense of community is important to hold together the institutions of a fair and a just society. And thirdly, simply either taking out of the market or massively regulating what's called the commanding heights of the economy. This means things like infrastructure, healthcare, banks, finance, these sorts of things, which are the pillars on which a modern capitalist society runs. So these are the basic institutional requirements, I think, for what a feasible socialism will be. The extent to which we move forward on them varies from socialist to socialist, but all agree on basically reducing the scope of the market, increasing the scope of planning, and reducing the ability for people with lots of money to have lots of political influence as well. All right, that's what I'm going to mean by this. So the question then, again, is it time for the US to embrace socialism? The answer is a resounding yes. It is indeed that time. And now I'm going to try to give you some arguments as to why that's the case. The main reason we say on the left that it's time to embrace socialism is simple. It's that an unfettered market, an unregulated and uncontrolled capitalist economy significantly reduces the autonomy of individuals and their ability for self-determination. This is the fundamental goal that socialists since Marx have had, in spite of these monstrosities like Stalinism, in spite of all the crimes that the Bolshevik regime committed. The goal that always motivated and inspired socialists or people to socialism was what Marx called organizing human arrangements to maximize the chances for human flourishing. And what human flourishing requires more than anything else is autonomy, self-determination. And the market, socialists say, while it does at times and in certain ways provide opportunities for autonomy, it is also the domain of a massive concentration of economic power which squelches the autonomy of the vast majority. Now, how does it do that and why? Well, there are many markets. There's not a market in capitalism. So when we say the market does this, what do we mean? Well, whatever other market there is in capitalism, for whatever goods you have a market for, the one defining element of a capitalist economy is a market for labor power, what we call the labor market. Now, the main difference between libertarians and socialists really comes down to their conceptualization, their understanding of how the labor market works. In the left's understanding of the labor market, it is not a domain for the unfettered exercise of free choice. Indeed, it is a domain where there is a massive concentration of power and a massive inequality between the leverage and the bargaining options between employer and employee. Because in the labor market, employers have enormously more resources and more power than their employees, they are able to set the terms of the labor exchange in a way that benefits them, and typically benefits them that in a fashion that constrains not just the autonomy of their employees, but does so to their detriment, to the detriment of their well-being. How? Employees, the various aspects of the labor contract are set by the employer, and what this means is the employer has power to set wages, working hours, how long the employee is going to work for him, the working conditions. That involves things like safety, it involves things like the pace of work, and finally, of course, because the employer has control over 8, 10, 12 hours of the employee's life while he or she is at the workplace, it also gives the employer indirect control and influence over the employee's life outside the workplace. Because of the exhaustion, because of the enormous physical costs that very fast paces of work, long hours imposes on the employee, it means when they're away from the workplace, much of their time is spent simply recuperating, getting ready to work again. For many employees today, underwork is a major problem because employers want maximum flexibility in how much time any given employee works for them, which means that employees now on any given day don't know when they're going to be called in, which obliterates the very idea of free time. Because what they're doing most of the time is either sitting by the phone in case their employer calls, or because they're not getting enough hours at one venue, they have to seek out other employment. With other employment means they have to be now on the phone waiting for 2 employers to call them. What this means is the entire life of the employee is essentially colonized by the employer. This is because the employer calls the shots of when you work, how long you work, and in what fashion you work, not the employee. Now, this concentration of power in the last 50 years we've seen also breaks the connection, which is many people think is an essential component of economic justice. It breaks the connection between effort and reward. Because employers have the power to make first call on whatever revenues their employment, their firm, or their establishment is getting, the employers set the terms on how much the employees will get and how much they will get. In conditions where employers have unfettered power, which is what the United States has had the last 50 years, it means that the proportion of the total income that goes to the owner of a venue or the CEO increasingly has very little connection to their actual contribution. So 40 years ago, CEOs in the United States earned money in proportion to their employees to the ratio of like 35 to 1. By 2000, it had gone up to 350 to 1, 380 to 1. Now, it's inconceivable, if you follow marginal productivity theory, that CEOs suddenly were contributing 10 times more to the product than their workers were. There was one and only one reason why their pay increased so much faster than their employees: power. They could simply call the shots and take all the money for themselves, whether directly through the revenues of the firm or through the stock market. Now, this being the case, it means that the essential promise that the market makes to people, which is if you work hard, you will get the returns, the market itself is in fact undermining. And finally, in politics, the massive concentration of wealth, the massive concentration of economic resources translates into a massively greater influence in political power. This I should not have to, by now, rehearse, but let me just say the basic facts. Most working people know this. Opinion polls show that for the past 50 years, the majority of the American population has felt 2 things: that the political system is unresponsive to them, and the political system is captured by the wealthy. When asked directly, as late as 2015, 80% of Americans said the American government favors the rich more than it favors the poor. The result? Cynicism. Half the American electorate opts out of American elections, and it's, by and large, the poorer half. They feel that the system's been captured. The reason Bernie Sanders' campaign has taken off the way it has is because for the first time in 100 years, a major politician in this country is saying it doesn't have to be this way. The poor, working people have as much right to have an influence in the political system as what he says, the millionaires and billionaires. Yeah. I only have 15 minutes. So I will not read you the litany of numbers that tends to be overwhelming, but I'm sure you all know by now the story of the last 40 years. For the first time in American history, real wages have been stagnant for 2 generations. There's this famous graph, it looks like an alligator's mouth. What it shows is trends in productivity increases aligned with trends in real wages. What you've seen since 1973 in this country is that productivity increase has gone up rapidly, while real wages have been almost stagnant. And what that means is almost all the increase in income has gone to the top 10% of this population. What the most recent research shows is that 85% of all the income increases since 1980 have gone to the top 10%. The bottom 90% has had to share 15% of the increase in productivity. The bottom 50% has gained nothing. Working hours have gone up. Why? Wages are stagnant. Of course working hours have gone up. As working hours grow up, what happens? Injuries increase, fatigue increases. For the first time since World War I, the lifespan of the typical white male in the United States has gone down. Why? The main reason that's given? Despair. Their pensions have disappeared, their retirement has disappeared, they're in their 40s to 60s, they can't get new jobs, there's no one looking out there for them. Despair has led to the opioid crisis, a drugs crisis, and a health crisis. All right, well, all of these things have been accompanied, of course, by a quite dramatic capture of political power by the wealthy. The numbers on that are also clear. All right, so this is the background against things like the Sanders campaign, things like Ocasio-Cortez, the coming back of socialism into the political agenda. So what does it mean? I very airily gave you some ideas of what it meant earlier. Let me now be more specific. One thing it does not mean is the Soviet-style, one-party state, centralized planning that we saw in the communist world from the Bolshevik Revolution into the 1970s. Very few people on the left advocate for that anymore. Why? Well, first of all, obviously, it is the opposite of self-determination when you have a one-party autocracy ruling over you. Secondly, maybe centralized planning can work, but there's no evidence that it can. We've seen no evidence for it. So what most socialists will now argue for is not that model of socialism. What they will argue for is setting up institutions that will enable the principles that I enunciated later to be instantiated. What will those institutions mean? Well, first of all, I think, I said earlier, taking massive sections of the economy out of the commodified zones and making their goods available on a decommodified basis. What are these? I think a viable socialism has to mean a government-run system of several parts of the economy. One is healthcare. Healthcare should not be left up to the private sector. Second, education. Education is not a place for the private sector. Right now, we're still in the midst of this craze around charter schools. There is no evidence that charter schools consistently do better than public schools, and most of them are actually funded on public monies anyway. It's a complete boondoggle. There should not be any privately funded primary and secondary education. Thirdly, housing. Housing should be a social right. Cheap, affordable, and good housing should be provided by the government, not the slums that they've been building for the last 80 years. Half of Hong Kong lives in public housing. It's hardly something like Cabrini in Chicago. It is good housing, and there's no reason why you can't have good housing provided by the state. Transportation, of course you can have cars. Of course you can have your own. But every major city should have good, cheap, and high-quality public education. And in the United States, there needs to be a viable national system of rail transport. And if you ask me, these airlines should be nationalized yesterday. Privately funded media is dying. It won't exist a few years from now because the traditional model of media finance, which was advertising-based, is collapsing. Advertisers have now bolted from print media. They're never coming back. They bolted from television. They're never coming back. If there's going to be a future for media in this country, it's only going to come through a massive influx of public monies into it, massive influx of some kind of public support for it. So that's another sector that I think should be, in substantial measure, be given over to the public sector. Public utilities should not be privately run. Public utilities were, for decades on end, public entities, and they should go back to being public entities. All right, what does that leave? Quite a bit. It means a lot of what you consume privately. It means a lot of consumption goods, restaurants, movies, a lot of entertainment is still going to be privately run in the model that I'm saying. But it's not trivial that you'll have taken out more than half of this country's GDP from the commodified sector into some kind of government provision. That necessarily means some conception of planning as well. There's going to be some degree of planning that goes into the provision of all these goods, so it does conform in this manner to the traditional conception of what socialism is. Now, these are all the pillars of what it'll be. The second thing the call for socialism involves then is a question of strategy. If you're planning on taking over, whatever, 30, 40, 50, 60% of the economy and making it now publicly provided, you're talking about a fantastic attack on private capital. And they're not going to lie down and take it willingly. So any call for socialism also has to be a call for a political strategy. And the essence of that political strategy is that a call for socialism involves enabling and creating the institution for the organization and the mobilization of the poor. Historically, every case, whether it's Western Europe, whether it's the Global South, where anything like these institutions were built up that I'm arguing for, it came on the back of a massive and a mobilized labor movement. One reason why in the United States in the past 50 years you've seen a retreat on every one of these fronts is because of the collapse of the labor movement. So part of the socialist strategy, I think part of the call for socialism has to be a political vision that moves away from this idea that it's technocrats and enlightened politicians that simply deliver these goods from on high. It's going to have to come through the politics of this country reawakening, and in particular, reawakening of that sleeping giant, which is the poor, their capacity for social movements, their capacity for social change. If this can be done, if this can come together, I actually think it's not only possible, but it's more or less inevitable that we're going to see a change in the direction that I'm defending. Thank you.